Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our latest Independent Policy Forum. My name is David Thoreau, and I'm the president of the Independent Institute. We're delighted that you could join with us this evening. I think we have quite an interesting and provocative program, very timely for those of you who follow high technology media and public policy comes and goes. Those of you who are not familiar with the Independent Institute, hopefully you all got a packet. There's background information about our program, including membership and subscription opportunities. I want to point out the new issue, by the way, of our new journal, which we started a while back. And I'd say it's a rather eye-catching cover. The issue has the cover story called Watching You, subtitled Systematic Federal Surveillance of Ordinary Americans. And anyone interested in privacy, I strongly recommend that you take a look at that. The Institute itself is a scholarly public policy research institute. We produce many books in addition to the journal, many other studies and conference and media programs based on that work. Our interest is not to mimic or get involved in political intrigues or political battles. Our interest is to try and get to the heart of public policy disputes and the actual effects of government on these problems. In the packet, you'll also find a sheet on tonight's program. It also lists two of our upcoming policy forums, the next of which will be on November 17th. And that program is on the American Civil War. And the topic of the program is actually human liberty and the roots of American Leviathan. The two speakers are the historian Henry Mayer, who's the National Book Award finalist for his book, All on Fire, on William Lloyd Garrison and the abolition of slavery. And the other speaker is the historian and economist Jeffrey Rogers Hummel, whose book, Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men, has gotten many people's attention. We will also be holding an event which is not yet scheduled. It will be either in December or January with the historian Robert Conquest. We've had Bob speak in the past, about 5 years ago, almost 6 years ago, I guess. Bob has a new book out called Reflections on a Ravaged Century. For those of you not familiar with Dr. Conquest, he is the author of a number of landmark books, including The Great Terror, Harvest of Sorrow, Stalin, and other books, especially on the Soviet Union. Tonight's program is one that we're very pleased to be hosting. We're very pleased that we have two excellent speakers on this topic. For those of you who are not familiar with this book, we highly recommend that you get a copy. It's a book that we think is not just important, but perhaps even revolutionary in the whole field of commerce and money and finance and privacy. Our first speaker tonight is an economist who has been involved in a whole range of fields. He's the author of The End of Money. The End of Money, I should mention, is published by our friends at the Discovery Institute in Seattle, who've been very helpful with us on many occasions, including helping us arrange for Richard this evening. Almost daily, it seems, there seems to be some sort of event pertaining to the issues that we're going to be discussing this evening, especially in the world of public policy. Many of you may remember the recent proposal and the fight to stop a program called Know Your Customer, which was a series of regulations that would have dramatically changed people's financial situation as far as the government's involvement, at least monitoring-wise. But it seems like there's almost a daily proposal, or we hear of reports of discussions of proposals for the government to monitor financial records, to wiretap, to monitor email, to censor the internet, to tax website transactions, and so forth. Indeed, the prospects of a world in which private transactions are uncontrollable by government is something that many politicians and bureaucrats are not too pleased about. The procedure we're going to use tonight is I'll first introduce Dr. Richard Rahn, and he'll be followed by our second speaker, Peter Thiel, and afterward we'll have questions from you for both speakers. Richard Rahn is President and Chief Executive Officer of Novecon Limited and Senior Fellow at the Discovery Institute. Dr. Rahn formerly served as Vice President and Chief Economist at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and Editor-in-Chief of the Journal of Economic Growth. He received his PhD in Business Economics from Columbia University, and he served as the U.S. co-chairman of the Bulgarian Economic Growth and Transition Project. He's also been Executive Director of the American Council for Capital Formation in Washington. He's also been Washington Economic Consultant for the New York Mercantile Exchange, Professor of Management and Head of the Graduate Department of Management at Polytechnic University. He's been National Executive Director of the Ripon Society and a member of faculties at numerous universities, including Florida State, Rutgers, George Washington, and George Mason University. Richard is someone who has been a leading light in a whole number of cutting-edge economic areas, but I'll let him discuss one tonight. So I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Richard Rahn.
Well, David, thank you very much for having me here. I've been very impressed with the work of the Discovery Institute, and particularly your new journal here. I thought the one I was in honor of me, but as David mentioned, I live in Virginia, but I work in downtown Washington. And I recently became aware that I spent much of my working life within 6 blocks of the White House. It's been the longer 6 blocks in the last 8 years than I had been previously, or last 7 years, I guess it's been now. Washington is that place where our former esteemed mayor once said, the crime rate in Washington wouldn't be bad at all if it wasn't for all the murders. Tonight I'm here to talk about the future world and the future of money specifically. And my interest in the topic goes back many years, and the great Nobel Prize-winning economist Keynes had talked about the denationalization of money, of currency, and this seemed somewhat futuristic, and a number of us had sort of played with the notions for many years. Hayek, who did I say? Keynes, no. I'll tell you what happened. I was talking tonight to Bert Knapp. He told me he knew Keynes. That's why I was thinking about Keynes. Of course, it was Hayek, Friedrich Hayek. And I never knew Keynes. Keynes died a long time ago. Bert remembers him, but I don't. But I did know Hayek, as many of you here, David and others knew. And we had played around with his concepts to see if he could make it a reality. And it looked very difficult. But suddenly the world changed. Technology changed. And we had the development of the internet, low-cost computing power, sort of the end of bandwidth, and by that I mean low-cost international telecommunication. In fact, with the internet, it's getting to be almost free. The rise of public key encryption. All these things came together. And so what Hayek had talked about suddenly was possible. And when I was working in Eastern Europe, in Bulgaria and Hungary and Estonia, and particularly Russia and the former Soviet Union, we were trying to see how we could create new payment systems. In these countries, there were no checking systems. There were no clearing systems, as those of you who know about banking at all. Nobody had checking accounts. Everything was done in cash. It was a very primitive economy in many ways. So we thought, well, maybe we'll just skip checks altogether and go right to electronic commerce. And that caused me to start investigating what was the state of the art, looking at things like smart cards and other types of digital transfers. And then I found that virtually nothing was being written upon this in the standard economic literature. The Journal of the American Economic Association and others were not talking about this. But in places like Wired magazine, they were. And the people who were doing that understood what the technologies could do, but they didn't understand much about international monetary mechanics. So I tried to bring them together all in this book, along with looking at the various public policy issues involved. Now, this stuff that we all carry around here with us, here's a dollar bill. This one is an old one. It's got Robert Rubin's name on it, so it can't be that old. But anyway, it's wrinkled and it's dirty. They carry a lot of germs, and they find that like 60% of them have traces of cocaine on them. So if they ever want to bust you, they just pick up your money and say, aha, there's a trace of cocaine, because virtually all money has it. But this is a rather primitive way of doing things, and it's even worse with coins. We all carry around some of these coins, and you never have the right set of coins and these things for the vending machines or the parking meters or the other things where you need them. Of course, in the digital age, all that can disappear, because we can go to smart cards, which is nothing more than like a credit card with a chip in it, where you can actually put the money in a card we call a cash purse. But the really radical change that's taking place is real-time settlements. The reason you have this stuff is this is a non-earning asset. And even with low levels of inflation, you lose 1 or 2% of the value of it each year. And most of us carry around some quantity of this stuff. And the reason we do it, it has, what's the value of that piece of paper? Not much. But it's because there's a time period between getting rid of one productive asset and acquiring another productive asset or a good or service we want. But in the digital age, this time period can collapse to a fraction of a second. And suddenly the need for money as we normally thought of it begins to disappear. Now, you still need a numeraire in which to make transactions. We have to have the dollar or euro or something that we define relative values in. But the existence of money as we traditionally think of it, that is going to disappear. And it's going to disappear fairly rapidly. The technologies are now there. And I expect many of you here are involved in various aspects of technologies, which will have an impact on that. But just think about it here in the next few years, over the internet, from your home computer or from your telephone, you will be able to take money and transfer it around the world virtually at the speed of light. Not only that, with advances in public key encryption, you can easily encrypt it just with a couple keystrokes on your computer, and no government or anybody else will know what you've done. And with the new public key encryption, it's almost impossible for NSA to break. Fortunately, being in Washington, I had access to a lot of high-ranking CIA and NSA people and others who are sort of panicked about this development, because in the old days, if somebody wanted to tap your phone, it wasn't done as it was done in the movies. They didn't have to have somebody break in your office to tap your phone. It was all done down at the telephone company. People don't realize that. They got a court order, and the telephone company was all set up, and on the old analog systems, they basically just listened in, and they knew what was going on. Telephone companies switched over to digital systems. Suddenly it became a whole lot more difficult. But the phone companies would give the FBI or the NSA or CIA or whoever they wanted to listen in their codes to their digital systems so they could listen in. But suddenly that's to say that David here wants to send a private message to Peter. Well, with public key encryption, this is easily done. You just download these programs. You can get them off the internet or buy them from any software store, and you can transmit messages. And the courts, fortunately, have ruled that encryption is protected under the First Amendment. It's freedom of speech. And so you can use whatever level you want, and for all intents and purposes, two of you can have messages that NSA or nobody else, clearly the FBI, cannot break. The Clinton administration and Janet Reno's Department of Justice came up with a proposal a couple months ago. They said, well, this is just terrible. We can't let this happen, have people have private conversations. And so they had a proposal to allow the FBI to break into your home and put devices on your computers to read the keystrokes you were making because it didn't do them any good any longer to actually get the message. But if they could get in to see what David was actually typing on his computer before he encrypted it, what Peter was decrypting, then they could know what was going on. Well, fortunately, we still have enough people in the Congress who said this was outrageous, that would not go anyplace, and the administration seems to have backed off on it. But this is the continuing struggle between financial privacy and these new technologies, because these new technologies will be very liberating. Now, in a digital world, there's not much reason for the Federal Reserve to produce money anymore. This says a Federal Reserve note. This is part of the U.S. debt. You know, when you hear about how much debt we have, this stuff you carry around in your pocket is part of the debt. And just as an aside, I've been sort of interested in all these folks talking about paying off the federal debt. Well, if we paid off the debt, what would we use for our money? But I don't think you have to worry about that. But we won't have a need for Federal Reserve notes, and most of the money will be supplied by private institutions. Now, it doesn't have to be supplied by banks. And I think the banks are facing a very difficult future, because in the digital age, there's no reason McDonald's or Microsoft or Boeing or any other well-known company can't go ahead and start supplying money. You know, before we had the Federal Reserve System in 1914, and I know Burke remembers this, but then we had most of the money in the U.S. was privately issued and by individual banks. Now, the federal government defined the dollar, you know, in terms of gold or silver. They had a variety of things over time. But the government defined what the value of the currency was. But most of the money was actually issued by banks. And well-known banks like Citibank or Bank of America or so forth, their money would trade at par. And a lesser-known bank, they might have a discount on it. But the same thing is likely to happen in the digital age. I'm not sure how all this will sort off. But if you had something that said a McDonald dollar, well, most people figure McDonald's is probably a pretty strong corporation. You're surely familiar with the name, and you'd probably be willing to accept them. Much like the frequent flyer miles that airlines now have. And they're starting to be used for not just airline purchases, but for other products. They're beginning to hit. Huh? Well, no, not yet. But they're beginning to expand out. And what I think you'll see is companies, maybe like a McDonald's, I know Burger King's already done one experiment, with a frequent purchase program where they give you a smart card and you can get, what's it, Whoppers at Burger King, right? You get 5, I'm trying to remember what all these, which fast food franchise has which, but you can get like 5 Whoppers for the price of 4 if you have the smart card and you buy smart cards for other people. But there'll be a tendency to allow these to be used for other purchases. So they'll evolve in a number of different ways. In Europe, it's much more evolved than it is here in many countries. Places like Finland, you can use smart cards and parking meters. But just think of something like a vending machine. Vending machines have these electromechanical devices in them for putting dollar bills in, and like a wrinkled old dollar bill like this will probably be rejected. These things break down. Drug addicts and thieves break into them. And they're expensive to maintain. They're expensive to produce. But if you go into the digital world and you just stick a card in, or you just flash your card by it, because some of them it can be read by infrared, and that just takes out the 75 cents or $1 or whatever it is for the item you want on the vending machine. The vending machine has digits in it. There's no incentive for anybody to break in. These little card reader writers are a fraction of the cost of the electromechanical devices we now use. Think in parking meters, where you don't have to run out every few minutes and put new quarters in the thing. It's timed. That's already done in Finland and a number of other places. So we have this radical new world which is well on its way, and it's going to be a much better world. Now, when I talk about this and I say that we won't move totally to digital money unless we have the same degree of anonymity as we have with this. And people want to make a number of anonymous purchases. both for good and not so good reasons. But you don't want to have a trail for everything you produce or everything you buy. At least most people don't. And when David wants to pick up his copy of Hustler, he may not want Mary to see that on his credit card. And is that true? Yeah. So he probably uses cash when he does that. And people have lots of reasons of not wanting to have a total electronic trail of everything they buy. And so I think it's very important we maintain the anonymity. You got to have the privacy. You don't want to have total big brotherism. Now, there are a bunch of people in Washington, Justice Department, the FBI, and other places say, oh no, this is terrible. We want it to know what everybody earns. We want to see every cent goes into them and every cent that goes out. I think our founding fathers would be appalled at this concept, but these are the kind of battles that are going on. And they've resisted the movement towards anonymous digital money systems. I got sort of fed up with listening to their arguments of how we can't have anonymity, and they usually say because you have increases tax evasion and money laundering and drug dealing. So I looked up the data. Last year, 932 individuals were convicted of money laundering in the U.S. 932. Our population is 270 million. We had 18,000 murders. Now, how many of those people were killed because somebody was trying to take somebody else's this stuff? Good share of those. We had several million robberies, several tens of millions of thefts. Most of it was trying to get this stuff. If you go to a digital world, you greatly reduce the opportunities for crime. The convenience stores, the all-night convenience stores, the gas station, banks, and so forth, which are prone to having people come in with guns to hold them up. If there's no money there, what are you going to steal? Now, you can steal somebody's smart card, but you can have any degree of security you want on a smart card. You can have them, so if somebody steals it, they can use it. Or you can put a PIN code or a thumbprint or a voice print or facial profiles, all kinds of things you can do with them, whatever level of security you want. So I think that the argument about crime is bogus. It is basically a battle over big brothers in Washington wanting to monitor every bit of your behavior. This history of looking into people's bank accounts is quite new. Traditionally, and again, Burke remembers this, that gentlemen did not want to, gentlemen didn't read other gentlemen's mail, and they didn't look into their bank accounts. That was considered privacy. And actually, from the time of the Magna Carta and our Anglo-Saxon tradition, we had this concept of privacy. And governments had not had the authority, generally, to look into people's bank accounts. That changed in 1933. Hitler's Germany was the first country to put down a law to deny financial privacy. It was a decree made by Hitler in 1933 called for the protection of the state and the individual. For your protection. Doesn't this sound sort of familiar? And so this gave the German government the right to look at everybody's bank account. And this is the thing that caused a lot of Germans, particularly German Jews, to move their money out of Germany to Switzerland and other places to try to hide it from the authorities, because it was setting up for seizure. Again, as a little aside on this, you might have been reading these stories about the Bank of New York and this Russian money laundering thing. I'm willing to bet that virtually nobody will get convicted of money laundering, because I've read through a lot of this. This is basically flight capital. I've been to Russia 31 times in the last 9 years. I know the country fairly well. I've been all over it. I've been an economic advisor there. The Russian government has stolen the savings of the people at least 3 times over the last dozen years. They've stolen it by inflation. And when you have hyperinflation, that's the government doing nothing more than stealing the money. So you've had some poor Russian woman who has saved up for many years, put her money in a state savings account, and that has been her little nest egg. And 3 times in the last dozen years it's been totally wiped out. So any sensible Russian, of course, is going to put their money in dollars. Most Russians hold currency. In fact, 70% of the U.S. currency is outside the country. They want to get their dollars, not only in Russia, they worry about them being seized there, but of course they want to get them out. That is sensible. If you were faced with the same kind of economic situation in Russia, you would also want to get your money out. Now, I don't think the people who want to get the money out are the criminals. I look at the government as being the criminal. And we get this all backwards, because the government has been engaged in theft. And inflation is theft. We can spend a lot of time on this, but I think probably most of you are well aware of that phenomenon. I'm not going to talk much about the technology because Peter's been more deeply involved in much than I have, so I'll concentrate on some of the public policy aspects. One of the big battles, as I've already mentioned, is the battle over encryption. And there has been these attempts to try to deny encryption or keep low levels. And if you have a low enough level of encryption, then of course the FBI or the NSA or others can get into it. And again, we've been lucky that the courts have ruled in our favor domestically. It's a First Amendment guarantee. So then the government fell back to trying to control the exports of encryption. My laptop PC, I've got encryption program in it. Now, if I took that out and took it overseas, now they actually say I can have it in my laptop for my own personal use even when I'm traveling. But if I sold it to somebody, then I could be in trouble. Of course, these same encryption programs you get them for free over the internet. And encryption is something, because it's mathematical algorithms, so how do you control it? I first came aware of the stupidity of the government's position, I think it was back in about 94, that we were trying to set up electronic payment systems in Russia and moving to smart cards and so forth. And I was working with a Russian smart card company. It was providing software for the reader-writers and things. And they wanted the up-to-date stuff on encryption. There's a guy named Bruce Schneier that probably many of you know, who has got the sort of basic Bible of encryption. So I said, I'll bring his book over. It was a big seller here in the U.S. In the back cover of his book, he's got 2 discs that have the algorithms which are written out in the text. In the back of the book, you have the algorithms, but he also had them on discs, so you could just drop them in your computer. Well, when we were ordering the books, Bruce had called up and talked to one of my associates, and he said to her, if you're going to take these out of the country, you got to take the disc out because those are considered munitions. The same algorithms were actually in the book. I mean, you just had to scan it and put it back in the computer. But since it was written, that's freedom of speech and protected by the First Amendment. But the discs were considered munitions. And the more I got into this and looked at the whole stupidity of this thing. And so the government's trying to control something you can't control. Now, the software companies who provide encryption programs, they've been a big disadvantage because they've had to set up offshore operations to market this. And so much of the encryption programs have moved over to Japan, Switzerland, and Belgium, and Finland, and other places which don't have any restrictions on it. And finally, the administration seems to be beginning to back off on it. But it's much like so many things in Washington, the people are brain dead. It's much like prohibition. I mean, prohibition clearly couldn't work because there was a demand for alcoholic beverages. I know that shocks you. But there was a demand for alcoholic beverages. And people knew how to make wine. They knew how to make beer. Bathtub gin. I'm not sure I know how to make bathtub gin, but yeah, but I'm a Virginian, and we're slow to learn these things. But anyway, all this was out, and of course it was ludicrous that if there's a demand, the supply isn't going to be there. And there's a demand for high-level encryption, and people are going to get it, and it's easy because the basic fundamentals of how you do public key encryption now are known. If any of you are interested, there's plenty of books out there on it. I've got some of them referenced in my book. But this was there's a whole loony policy in Washington. The other big battle, of course, is over bank secrecy. We have something called the Bank Secrecy Act passed in 1970. But in typical Washington fashion, the Bank Secrecy Act is actually the Anti-Bank Secrecy Act because it forces your banker to spy upon you. It prohibits banks from giving bank secrecy, even though it's called the Bank Secrecy Act. And originally, they had a limit of $10,000 in cash transaction, and there was these currency transaction reports the banks had to file, and that was in 1970, would be equivalent to $40,000 today, but they kept lowering the level, and they made it 5 and down to 3, and then David talked about the Know Your Customer regs, which is going to bring it down to 0. When I was doing the book, I went around and talked to a number of bank compliance officers for big banks, and they were talking about the huge cost of having to train all their personnel to look for suspicious activities. You know, David, let's say he normally takes $100 of cash out a week for spending cash off a checking account. Suddenly, one week, David goes in and takes out $300. Aha! A suspicious activity. A report goes to Washington. And if the banks don't do that, they're fined. It's a huge burden. So I started looking at the cost of this for the whole banking system. Well, it ran into hundreds of billions of dollars. And then I looked at the number of convictions. Now, I calculated that the convictions seemed to cost more than $100 million when you look per conviction, if you looked at total public and private sector cost. And everybody was screaming about Ken Starr spending $44 million and he got 17 convictions. Well, FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, is out there, and I think their numbers are like a $100 million conviction. And I've debated some of their people, and they've never come back with figures to prove me wrong, so I suspect my numbers are too low. The other area is taxation. And taxation, this is a fascinating problem. I assume that there's probably a libertarian leaning in this audience. No.
Where did you get that idea?
Well, friends of David. Okay. David gave me 1 minute here. Let's see if I can do it all in 1 minute. Okay. This book. Now think about it. Let's assume I had written in London rather than in Virginia, and that I had a British publisher, but I had a printer in Toronto, Canada, a wholesaler in Memphis, Tennessee, that when I sold it through Amazon.com, a Seattle, Washington company with warehouses in Reno, Nevada, if a Virginia resident had been on vacation in Florida and with their portable computer had ordered from Amazon using a credit card, a Visa card on a Bermudan bank, now please tell me, who would have the right to tax the transaction, and how would you enforce it? And you've got all these states talking about internet taxation. There's a moratorium right now. It's lunacy. And last spring, the state of California, there was a group there formed a task force to come up with how they would tax it. Then they brought a few of us in, some of the fellows from the big accounting firms who were tax accountants and a few tax lawyers, and a couple of economists like myself who commented on this. And it took us about an hour and a half to take these people apart, not because we were so much smarter, but the problems of internet taxation are overwhelming. And you even have to have a massive violation of civil liberties, of monitoring everything. And the final word, since he's cutting me off here, is that think about the electronic age. If there is an electronic hole any place in the world, if any country, any place in the world decides not to go along with these controls, everything flows through it. And what this is going to force, I think, is a downsizing of government, which is good. And but we've got a huge battle in front of us because the totalitarian forces which reside in Washington, they don't even realize they're totalitarian forces. That's part of the shame of it all. They come up with these things and they don't realize they're Hitler Juniors. They think they're doing it to help us. But we've got to, it is going to be a big effort over the next few years, and we have to win the battle. We've pretty well won the battle on encryption. It's not over yet, but pretty well won that. The bank secrecy, we've got a lot of work to do there. And the tax battles are the two big ones. And I hope you will all join in the fight. David, again, thank you. And tell everybody to buy this book.
No, read the book. It doesn't matter whether they buy it. They just got to read it. It matters to me whether they buy it.
It matters to us, too. Thank you very much, Richard. Our next speaker is, as you know, Peter Thiel. Peter is the chairman and chief executive officer of Confinity Incorporated. Peter's also been a research fellow here at the Independent Institute. He's the past president of Thiel Capital International. He's also worked as a derivatives trader at Credit Suisse Financial Products. He's been a securities lawyer for Sullivan and Cromwell. He's been a speechwriter for William Bennett, a law clerk for Judge Larry Edmondson of the U.S. Court of Appeals. Peter graduated Phi Beta Kappa from Stanford University, and he received his law degree from Stanford Law School. He's a co-author with David Sachs of an institute book called The Diversity Myth, Multiculturalism and Political Intolerance on Campus. It's a book on the issue of privacy and civil liberties in higher education. And his articles have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Washington Times, San Francisco Chronicle, and many other places. And for those of you who are interested, he's also rated a national master in the U.S. Chess Federation. I'm very pleased to introduce Peter Thiel.
Well, David, thank you very much for that long introduction. I don't know if I gave you permission to go through my whole resume, but I guess you're not the government, so that's okay. Well, I want to thank the Independent Institute for putting this event on and giving us an opportunity to step back a little bit and think about some of the bigger kinds of questions that we deal with. We often have these focuses on the immediate kinds of questions. If you look at the headlines in the news on a given day, people will not be spending a lot of time talking about digital money, and you always have sort of the urgent things displacing the truly important things. And I think this is one of the things that's quite big, quite important, and there are a lot of interesting questions it raises about the nature of money, about the nature of capitalism, politics, and the world. And so I want to step back a little bit today and look at some of these questions, talk a little bit about some of the technology that will be used to implement some of the changes we're talking about, and try to keep these things fairly brief and let you guys and gentlemen and women ask some questions at the end of the presentation. Money is one of those things that's very, I guess, it's something you see every day, but the more you reflect about it, the more mysterious it becomes. Your typical dollar bill, as Richard pointed out, has no intrinsic value, and yet it is something that people value extremely highly. And so there's sort of this weird kind of subterfuge that goes on when people think about money. It's something that's used, it has value, it's valued by everybody, you can use it to buy things in an economy, and yet it's something that has no intrinsic value. And the kinds of contexts where one can really see this sort of stuff break down are cases where money is sort of in a twilight zone, where it's breaking down. And there have been, of course, countless episodes in the 20th century in the emerging world where governments have gone out of control and have just started printing money like crazy, and the institution has started to collapse, and the link between money and value has really eroded. I'll give you the classic examples are ones like Argentina in the late 1980s, where you had hyperinflation. They had to raise prices in stores 3 times a day. The government was printing that much money. And so the upshot was that when people got their paychecks, they had to physically run to their bank accounts and physically run through a grocery store to make their purchases and try to pass the money on to someone else. It was like this game of musical chairs, and the chairs were taken away pretty fast, so you had to keep running really, really fast. The government of Idi Amin in the 1970s ran out of money, and so they asked the Treasury Secretary. The Treasury Secretary came to the dictator in Uganda and said, we have no money left. You've spent it all. And said, well, just print more. And, again, these are sort of extreme examples, and yet they're not totally inappropriate in any other context. I think perhaps the worst hyperinflation in the 20th century took place not in the Weimar Republic in Germany, not in Hungary, in the between wars era in any Latin American country. It took place in Yugoslavia, or Serbia in particular, in the 1990s, where in the course of the last 10 years, they've inflated the currency by 23 orders of magnitude, which means that one dinar in 1989 can buy about as much as 10 to the 23rd dinars would today. Now, periodically, they just lopped off a few zeros, and then they would reinflate, and they lop off a few more zeros. And so, Richard talked about the government basically stealing everything in Russia 3 times in the last 12 years. Well, if you think that every time one order of magnitude is like 90% theft, it's in pretty much they've stolen everything in the country 23 full times. And the remarkable thing is that they've gotten away with it. They've been able to sort of blame everybody else except for the government. For 10 years, they've been quite effective in generating a series of scapegoats to divert people's attentions. I think sort of another example is Mobutu Zaire. In the late 1990s, they periodically flew in these jumbo jets from France where they had the printing presses. They didn't have nothing worked in Zaire anymore, not even the printing presses. So they had to fly in the jumbo jets with the physical currency. And by the time the government was coming to an end, they'd gone up to 1 million Zaire note. I don't remember exactly what the currency was called. And basically, people in Kinshasa and the capital were no longer accepting it as legal tender, because they were accepting 100,000 notes, but million, this just seemed like too much. And so they actually had to rent some more jets and fly to some local provincial capitals where people were a little bit more behind the times and were still willing to accept these million denomination notes. Now, these are sort of the extreme examples. When we talk about, but when we talk even about countries like the US, Western Europe, and so on, there has been a significant erosion of monetary value. And the single currency in the world that has been the most robust currency in the last half century is the Deutschmark in Germany. And even so, one Deutschmark today has only about 20% of the purchasing power of one from 50 years ago, around 1950. So it would only buy you as much as 20 pfennigs would have in 1950. With respect to US dollars, it's about 10 cents on the dollar over the last, it's been inflated by about a factor of 10. And with respect to British pound sterling, you're down to about a factor of 20, and so on down the line. So it's the sort of stuff that happens on geological time. It's something people don't generally notice, and yet the musical chairs are slowly pulled away. And the fundamental problem, when we think about it, comes back to this initial paradox I started with, which is that money has intrinsically not very much value. And the nexus, the place where you have value in a capitalist society is in intellectual labor, in real property, in the relationships that exist between people as they work together in corporations and as individuals, in the kinds of trading relationships you have. And to the extent money is closely linked to that, it has real value. To the extent the link gets broken more and more, it has less and less value. And one of the questions is, and the sort of the fundamental philosophical question is, who gets to control that link between the medium of exchange and the goods that are exchanged? And to the extent it's controlled by governments, you can have governments where it erodes in small ways, like in Germany or the United States, or in very big ways, like in Zaire or Serbia in the 1990s. And to the extent it's controlled by individuals, it's likely that you can have a currency which is linked to real value and therefore does not erode at all. And what I want to sketch out is sort of the optimistic, futuristic scenario in terms of how we might be able to move from the world today of massive government and massive fiat money into a world in the early to mid-21st century where this will no longer be the case at all and where it will be very, very different. I think one of the basic paradigm for thinking about this is as a reverse Grisham's law. Grisham's law is the law in economics which says that good money gets displaced by bad money over time. It comes from the Middle Ages when the sovereign was able to coin gold coins, and then every now and then he collected some in taxes and melted them down and coined coins with less gold content in them and had more coins to spend. And then people in the rest of the economy would gradually take the ones with the high gold content out, and so gradually the currency got worse and worse and worse. A reverse Grisham's law would work something like the following. It will be something where you have a choice between different currencies, and the choice is not left to the sovereign, but to the individual. And in a sense, the individual becomes sovereign and is able to make choices regarding which currency they want to take. And when the individual makes these choices, they will choose better currencies rather than weaker currencies. And there's sort of a two-step process that I think this will go through. The first step is one in which we will go from really bad currencies, like, let's say, the currency, the Serbian dinar or the Russian ruble, to currencies where the link is not quite as troubled, like, let's say, the US dollar. And then the second step is where we will get rid of currency in the fiat conventional sense altogether, and it will be replaced by some kind of asset classes on real assets. And I want to sort of suggest to you that this process is already quite a bit further along than people think on both scores. The first one, going from rubles to dollars, or from Zambian kwachas to dollars, or Brazilian real to dollars. The fact of the matter is that in many ways, given the global telecommunications network, given the interconnected world we live in, it is increasingly possible for people to substitute their currency for others. Richard mentioned the statistic that 70% of the U.S. physical currency is now held outside of the country. One of the remarkable numbers is in the case of Russia. It's estimated something like $40 billion in physical cash is held in Russia. Only about $180 billion is held in the United States. The Russian economy is about 1/10 the size of the U.S. economy, so that in effect a greater percentage of the Russian GDP today is held in physical U.S. dollars than of the U.S. GDP. And the same thing is true in a lot of these other emerging market countries. In China, the number is something like 30 billion U.S. dollars. India, it's 20 billion. Argentina, Mexico, 10 to 15. And what's basically happened in these countries is you have periodic currency crises in which the currencies collapse, and you have banking systems that are controlled by very corrupt political elites, and every few years the banks collapse. And in Russia, they actually managed to do both at the same time last summer, where not only did the currency become worthless, but for good measure there was none left. So you went to a bank and there was no currency left either. They managed to pull it was unusual. Normally you only have to do one or the other, but sort of they just for good measure they reduced both the currency and the quantity to zero at the same time. And so you have people holding physical dollars, and this dollarization trend is a very, very powerful trend. It's in Russia, in a lot of these countries, it's now basically legal for people to have dollars, and in other countries it's still very illegal, but it's basically just being done by everybody. There are, of course, massive problems with holding dollars. The big ones are, again, some of the ones Richard identified in terms of theft. It's dirty, it's not very fungible, and so on down the line. And one of the questions is, how do you move from these physical dollars to electronic dollars? I think the basic technology is going to take place on the internet. I think the specific platform in the emerging world is going to be on a cell phone platform. If you look at the numbers, there are about 360 million, about 150 million online desktop-based accounts today. That number is projected to grow to about 350 million in the next 5 years. However, with respect to cell phones, internet-enabled cell phones, they're just getting rolled out right now. They already have some significant penetration in Japan, in Finland, in Sweden. They're getting rolled out in Western Europe, the U.S. next year. The numbers are projected to grow from about 10 million internet-enabled cell phones today to about 1 billion in 5 years. In 5 years from now, everybody who is a member of the middle class in the emerging world and in the developed world will have an internet-enabled cell phone. And this sort of a in China, the number is projected to go to something like 300 million cell phones, most of which will be internet-enabled. These people will have access to their bank accounts, and it will be very easy for them to move money into an account in a safe jurisdiction where the banks are not politically controlled, and they will basically be able to completely dollarize the economy. There will be no need to have any rubles or renminbi, and it will be non-traceable. No matter how illegal the Chinese Communist government says it is to hold US dollars, you will have a password on your cell phone, and the only way to stop this process would be literally to shut down the telecommunications network. And that's the kind of choice governments like China, India, some of these other countries are going to face. They will either have to shut down the telecommunications network and make it illegal for you to own a cell phone, or they will have to basically give up the kind of monetary sovereignty they've had and the enormous power that they've been able to wield as a result of this kind of sovereignty over the last many, many years. And I think this process is already full-fledged. The dollarization worldwide is going to be accelerated enormously by the technology. Now, the second theme is a little bit more speculative, and that is that getting rid of money altogether, going from digital dollars, from any kind of government-backed currency to purely private currencies. And what a private currency, or what private money, I think, fundamentally means is that there is no medium of exchange. You exchange value for value rather than exchanging value for something the government says has value for value. And whenever you have this intermediate step of the government saying something has value, that's where you have the subterfuge, the sort of legerdemain come in, the game of musical chairs, where every now and then a chair gets pulled out, and it turns out that you're the one holding a dollar bill that's all of a sudden become worth a little bit less. And the kind of exchange of value for value, the classic model would have been some sort of a barter model. That obviously has enormous transaction costs associated with it. These transaction costs go down in a digital age. And the kind of model that I think is the most likely to take place is one where you have other kinds of financial instruments that are very, very liquid. The one I would cite in the U.S. would be something like an index on the S&P 500. Or some sort of generalized stock market index, where instead of having currency as being the place where you have value, it is in real property, real companies, things that actually have real value. And so that you might conduct business by trading not dollars, but trading little slivers of the S&P 500, or of particularly large stocks like Microsoft or something like that. My guess is that it might be the whole stock market as a whole, and that as you trade these things, that's where you have the kind that becomes in effect a de facto currency. Now, this is still pretty far-fetched, but it is not quite as far-fetched as you might think. And just as we've had people in Russia replace rubles with dollars, we have had people in the U.S. replace dollars with equity. And over the last 20 years, one of the very big sort of financial debates that takes place is whether the U.S. equity market is wildly overvalued, or whether it's at a fair value or undervalued or anything like that. And one of the things people often talk about in making judgments about whether the equity market is overvalued is something called the risk premium on stocks. What is the expected return on equity over government bonds? And for much of the 20th century, the risk premium has been enormous. It's been something like 7-8% in the 1930s, 1940s, and even a decade ago it was still 4 or 5%. You expected to earn 4 or 5% more on equity than on bonds, and that's why they were priced. Today, the risk premium on equity has gone down to about 2%, and so people are saying they're not much more risky than government bonds. Now, if we really carry this digital argument to its conclusion, there will come a day at which the risk premium might be zero. If you actually look at the volatility in price, it's about the same. There's a strong theoretical reason for suggesting the risk premium should be zero, and maybe it should even be negative. Maybe, at the end of the day, companies like Microsoft and McDonald's and Intel and the whole conglomeration of companies has more intrinsic value than any given government, even the U.S. government. So if you believe that sort of trend is going to take place, we are already starting to see this kind of displacement. And again, it's always a question of whether you want to impute this particular explanation to it, but I think it is one interpretation of what's been happening with the equity markets is that they're basically starting to function as currency. And of course, this is the way people talk about stocks all the time, is that it's driven by liquidity, it's driven by people putting money into stocks, all of these things, because that's where people perceive the true value to really reside. There are some, questions in terms of what can go wrong with a scenario. And sort of, I agree with Richard on an awful lot of things. One place where I will disagree is not a big fundamental disagreement, but it's a disagreement on emphasis. Is I don't think the big fights on this are going to be fought in Washington, D.C. I think that, actually it's for all the reasons Richard cited. The people in D.C. are completely backwards. They don't understand any of the technology, and even to the extent they can, it can't be stopped. You cannot stop things on the level of Washington, D.C. in terms of shutting down these encryption protocols, things like that. I think that government actors who are intelligent and who understand what's happening have realized on some implicit level that the only way they're going to stop this kind of digital revolution is to hang together. They must hang together lest they all hang separately for exactly the same reason that otherwise you'll have money going to offshore jurisdictions where there's low taxes, privacy rights, things like that that are enforced. And the classic example I cite in this regard, and I think there's a very powerful push in this, is the whole formation of the euro trading zone in Europe in the last year. Perhaps the single biggest push for it was this realization that jurisdictional competition was inexorably pushing things in the direction of free markets. Western Europe today, there are 15 governments in Western Europe. I believe that 14 of them are effectively run by social democratic governments. It is the most left-wing configuration in the history of Western Europe in terms of the politicians who run it. They're not interested in a common currency because it helps business or it facilitates trade, even though those are the kinds of reasons that initially were used to push it and that were part of what drove it. They're interested in it because they see it as the first step towards political union, and they see political union as a precondition for preserving the welfare state and the massive governmental apparatus as it today exists in Western Europe. The euphemism that a lot of the politicians like to use in Western Europe is something called tax normalization. And what that means is that there should be no unfair tax competition which arises whenever one jurisdiction chooses to use lower taxes than another jurisdiction. And in a context of Western Europe where the jurisdictions are relatively small and it's possible for people to move to lower jurisdictions, such as the UK or Ireland, which are relatively lower than France and Germany and Italy, you want to harmonize these taxes and basically prevent this. And of course, Western Europe itself is not a logical stopping point. Sort of the one thing that's gone wrong with their plan is that the globalization has gone even faster than their political consolidation. So they've been able to consolidate these jurisdictions in Europe into a single large jurisdiction, but at the same time, there are all these offshore jurisdictions that have popped up and so on. And so you have people like La Fontaine, the former finance minister in Germany, who is, and the current finance minister in France and a lot of these countries, urging that transactions offshore jurisdictions be shut down, that basically it be made illegal to have offshore tax havens. And again, if you just sort of think about how in the world can this happen, or what does this mean? Well, what it means is that politically you have to create a de facto global government. You have to basically turn the whole planet into a prison to prevent anyone from escaping, because so long as there's a single place left to go, you will be able to do this. Now, there are questions as to whether anything like this is feasible or doable, and there are some difficult questions whether it's possible. My sense is that I'm optimistic in the sense that I don't think it's going to happen, but I think it is going to be a real fight. And it's not going to happen under the auspices of the United Nations or anything like that. It probably will happen through various multinational bureaucratic agencies. It will happen through collaboration between US, Western Europe, Japan, various governments, to basically make it illegal to put money into offshore jurisdictions. They will figure out ways to put very large pressure on these small countries. And there is a question of how islands in the Caribbean will be able to hold up if you have the US government or Western Europe basically send a fleet of ships down, try to shut them down. Now, there are questions about whether this is going to happen or not, but that is clearly what they are thinking. That is what intelligent socialists realize they need to do today to preserve the government as it is currently constituted. The stupid example of this, and sort of the counterexample, would be something like the government of Malaysia, which 1 year ago decided they want to basically prevent currency trading, and the government of Malaysia said, from now on, the Malaysian ringgit has value only inside of Malaysia. Outside of Malaysia, it's worth 0. Inside of Malaysia, it's worth 3.8 ringgit to the US dollar. Outside, you have to have an infinite number of ringgit to buy a dollar. You can buy ringgits with dollars, but you can't buy dollars with ringgits. And those were the basic rules they set up. And under those rules, they were able to basically create this artificial preserve within Malaysia. Now, that's not going to work 5-10 years from now. With the global telecommunications revolution, the internet access that we're talking about based on cell phones, that kind of a solution will no longer work. I think it is an open question whether the kind of push that's being made by people in Brussels for tax normalization across the world, whether or not that might work. So I have 1 minute to go here, and I think I actually may just leave it at that. I think that it is a very exciting future. I think that we are basically going to. There are incredible technological forces pushing us in the direction of digital currency, of a world of limited government, limited tax authority and ability. I think there are some very powerful countervailing forces, and we really should not underestimate it. And I think the sort of tension that has existed between technology and politics is in some ways likely to perhaps become even more exacerbated in the early 21st century. Thank you very much.